Hello. Just a word of thanks to Nimrod for organising such a wonderful workshop over the past couple of days, and for these excellent panel sessions as well. It's fantastic to be here and to be part of this event. I'll be talking a little bit about a series of studies that we've conducted in Northern Ireland, looking at residential mixing. So what happens when groups that have previously lived apart, have led separate parallel lives geographically, are moving together? What are the consequences for their experiences in terms of their interactions with people from the other group, in terms of their perceptions of themselves and their new communities? This is part of a programme of research with other colleagues at Nottingham Trent University, colleagues at Queen's University Belfast. In fact, those are social geographers at Queen's University Belfast, and colleagues Matt Easterbrook at the University of Sussex. And just to kind of start out, just reflect on the fact that residential contact, so contact between groups living in the same residential area, used to be at the centre of the contact hypothesis. In the 50s, 40s and 50s, there were several high-profile studies in the United States of what happened when different groups, often black and different white residents, came together to live in the same area, often social housing projects. And if you look back to the original formulation of the contact hypothesis, residential contact was considered in its own right as having promise to bring groups together. Since then, a number of things happened, and residential contact has faded into the background, a combination of changing policy in the United States in terms of public housing, in terms of conflicting findings that the initial promise of residential mixing wasn't really borne out by the results on the ground. A combination of things led to retreat into the background in social psychology. But in other disciplines, it's made something of a resurgence over the past 2 decades. And in particular, in political science, a focus on the consequences of residential diversification as a result of migration within countries and between countries, has focused on what happens when people come to live in the same areas together. And the picture is largely, from political science, a very negative one. So Robert Putnam, who's arguing that the life that we lead in our communities is very important for our well-being, the associations that we have of trust and mutual reciprocity is good for our health, also argues that diversification undermines these processes, undermines this support, and is bad for our health. And so in 2011, he outlined that the consequences of residential mixing could take 3 forms. Yes, bringing groups together could result in them getting on. The contact hypothesis could result in bonds being formed. Or, if resources are scarce and the groups are in opposition, it could cause conflict. But his analysis of large-scale surveys like the Community Benchmark Survey showed something slightly different, which was constrict theory. So when neighbourhoods diversify across the United States, people hunker down. They withdraw from those associations. They don't associate with their communities as much, and this undermines the positive health benefits of social capital. Okay. Now, since then, a debate has emerged as to whether this is actually true or not, and the findings are very much mixed. There's quite a bit of contrary evidence emerging. So, some researchers in the United Kingdom have found that the negative effects of diversification only impact upon deprived neighbourhoods, which initially have low levels of social capital to begin with. Other studies show that diversification increases contact, and where that does result in positive intergroup bonds forming, it's actually positive for community cohesion and well-being. But really, to summarise this body of literature, the effects tend to cancel out. Okay, they tend to be positive effects and negative effects. 2 comments upon this literature. First, it tends not to look at actual neighbourhoods, surprisingly enough. It doesn't go into neighbourhoods and talk to people and figure out what's happening at the neighbourhood level. And the second thing is that it provides actually quite a static picture. This research, typically cross-sectional, looks at residential diversity, not the process of diversification. Okay? So why is this important? Well, when you look at the social psychology of groups and group cohesion and health benefits, it's quite important in terms of dynamics and in terms of the actual groups that impact on your everyday life. Groups are good for you is the message that comes from the social cure tradition of literature that shows how group support and group resources in terms of helping, in terms of different forms of informational support, practical support, enable us to deal with the stresses and challenges that we encounter in everyday life, reduces our levels of stress, have really quite strong impacts upon our health and well-being. Okay? And anything that disrupts this actually has a negative impact. So major life events that disrupt our social group memberships tend to have negative life events. So retirement, okay, or bereavement, okay, or in this context, residential mobility, moving between different areas, losing group memberships, has been found at a local level and also a broad national level to have negative impacts upon health and well-being. So from this literature, communities, insofar as they form an integral part of our everyday lives, and so insofar as moving between communities has negative health benefits, is really crucial to understand when it comes to considering the impacts of residential diversification for those experiencing diversification, but for those moving between neighbourhoods as well. Okay. So, our research question is, is neighbourhood identity important for residents experiencing diversification? And secondly, how does identity transition, just looking at those moving between neighbourhoods, impact upon the experience of mixing, encountering people from different groups? And we're looking at the context of Northern Ireland. You'd be broadly familiar with the Northern Ireland as a post-conflict environment. The armed struggle lasted from the 60s to the 90s. The peace agreement in 1998, although it's faltering at the minute, the peace process isn't really in action for the past couple of years, has meant that violence has really subsided across the province. So low levels of violence, but also low levels of intergroup contact in many spheres of life. In terms of education, recreation, and geography is what we'll be focusing on. There's a map of Northern Ireland produced by one of our PhD students showing residential mixing or segregation. The areas in red are where there are 60% more Protestant than Catholic. Yeah. In dark blue, 60% more Catholic than Protestant. And you'll see that reflects many of the areas across Northern Ireland. Now, that is a picture that is changing. So between the census dates of 2001 and 2011, the areas that are becoming increasingly mixed have become more numerous. So there is evidence of mixing, geographical mixing, residential mixing happening, but its effects are less clear. When you look at the evidence in terms of contact in Northern Ireland, at a general level, in terms of the self-report surveys, at population level, the picture is quite positive. The more self-reported contact there is, the better attitudes there are towards members of the out group. But when you look specifically at residential mixing, when you look at the areas in which people, Catholics and Protestants, are coming together, the findings are actually quite uneven. Yeah. In some areas and for some people, residential mixing increases the level of contact, lowers the level of intergroup anxiety, and predicts lower levels of prejudice. But for others, and in some other areas, it actually predicts higher levels of threat, lower levels of contact, okay, and worse intergroup attitudes. Right? And for the qualitative research, when you look at on the ground what happens in neighbourhoods, actually you have a very varied range of experiences. Yeah, sometimes there is casual contact happening in neighbourhoods, but when there's political disturbances, people do withdraw and hunker down. So, against this background, we wanted to explore our research questions. So, Does a neighbourhood and the degree to which you identify with your local neighbourhood impact upon your experience of mixing? And then might there be different experiences for different types of people living within these neighbourhoods? Primarily those moving versus those who are there for the longer term. So, first paper, and we've actually just had this accepted today, which we're very, very pleased at, is looking at things from a quantitative perspective. So it's asking the questions about the impact of neighbourhood, of community identity, local community identity on people's experiences of mixing or attitudes towards the outgroup. And as I say, from the social cure tradition, we expect to see a positive relationship between neighbourhood identity and well-being. Groups are good for you. That's the line from the social cure tradition. From the contact hypothesis, we expect to see a relationship between neighbourhood norms of contact, experience of mixing, and intergroup attitudes. That's the standard relationships you'd expect from the contact hypothesis. And from the combined model that we're proposing, we would expect that community identification will actually facilitate better mixing and facilitate, more precisely, facilitate better attitudes towards other members of the other group within mixed residential areas. So, firstly, we analysed one of the province-wide surveys. This is the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, which runs every year on 1,000 or so participants right the way across Northern Ireland. So all communities here, those that are mixed, those that aren't mixed, those that are extremely politicised and exclusive, those that are very liberal and have high levels of people from living there from outside of Northern Ireland. So, this is a standardised survey that runs face-to-face across Northern Ireland with a randomised sample. And we selected 2012 because it had predictors that fitted our theoretical predictions. Identity, shared neighbourhood norms of intergroup mixing, and actual levels of self-reported mixing in terms of outgroup friends and neighbours. It also had the outcomes of well-being and attitudes towards the outgroup, Protestant attitudes towards Catholics and vice versa. And this is what we find. We find our first hypothesis, identification, predicts well-being. So that's identification with the local neighbourhood, predicts well-being. Okay. Also, the contact in terms of shared neighbourhood norms of mixing and actual mixing predicts better attitudes towards the outgroup. And they do this through the mediator of anxiety. Rhiannon was talking about this earlier, reduced intergroup anxiety and predicting better outgroup attitudes. But we also find that identification with your neighbourhood predicts better attitudes towards the outgroup through lowering your anxiety about meeting and having contact with people from the outgroup. Okay, so across Northern Ireland, these relationships hold. But as I say, there's a whole range of different communities that we're looking at there. And this could mask a lot of complex relationships that happen vary between these communities. So we looked at one community in particular, the Ravenhill Road area of Belfast, which is becoming increasingly mixed. There are two electoral wards around here. This shows predominantly Catholic, predominantly Protestant. These are mixed. This is an area of increased mixing, and you can see that the proportion of Catholics in the area decreased during the Troubles and has increased since. And these are becoming increasingly mixed areas. We custom designed a survey using specific measures taken from the social identity and contact literature, but we kept the same concepts in the model. Outcome measures being the World Health Organization measure of well-being and feeling thermometer. And we have the same pattern. We have much the same pattern. Okay, so we have community identity predicting well-being, the two norms and experience of mixing predicting outgroup warmth. And we also have community identity predicting outgroup warmth through lower levels of anxiety. So the message from the quantitative work is that community certainly has a positive impact upon your attitudes towards the other group, even in a recently mixed area where Catholics and Protestants are coming together and experiencing living side by side for the first time, really. Okay. Of course, this only looks at an aggregate of Catholics and Protestants, incomers and long-term residents. So the next step, if I have a couple of minutes to talk briefly about it, is to look at the experiences of incomers and what characteristics of their experience might predispose them towards positive or negative intergroup encounters with long-term residents. So we talked to incoming residents, to three mixed areas of Belfast, so here, here and here. We talked to 27 participants about their experiences. And what you might expect is that those moving into newly mixed areas of Belfast are quite apprehensive. They're quite apprehensive. They report people telling them to expect trouble, to expect conflict. Yeah? And they tell us that they don't actually find that, but a lot of people, that's what they'll be saying. There's always fighting or coming to flashpoints that be trouble. Okay? However, some of them, not all of them, some of them reported locals extending the hand of friendship, right? And they often reported this, especially when it was someone from the religious outgroup making them feel welcome. Okay, here's an anecdote whereby a Catholic incomer is mistaken for a Protestant, and so a Protestant neighbour says, "Do you fancy going for a pint to the Protestant pub around the corner?" He says, "I can't do that, I'm a Catholic." And the neighbour says, "That's fine, that's great," and they arrange to meet up and go elsewhere. So that extending the hand of friendship. And why is that important? Well, it's important because the majority of incomers reported some kind of ambiguous or disturbing or critical incident in the first few weeks or months of their arrival that caused them some uncertainty about their decision to move into a mixed area. Here's someone saying, it's a massive step to move out of where you feel secure to where you don't feel secure. I was only there 6 weeks. People running up the street and making a real riot. And then my neighbour, S, who is Protestant, this is a Catholic interviewee, said to me, you don't need to go worrying about that. They do that all the time at weekends. They come out of that street, they're noisy, but they don't mean any harm. You don't need to worry. And across the data set, we noticed that there were accounts like this. An ambiguous event provokes anxiety. It's initially perceived as threatening and potentially sectarian. People are worried that because they have moved into a mixed area, they might be the target of a sectarian attack. They immediately look to the neighbours for response, and for those who do have connections with the neighbours, they can get reassurance. For those who don't have connections with the neighbours, these were the ones who reported very high levels, chronic levels of anxiety, and were the ones who most often, in our limited sample, reported wanting to move out. Okay? So, here's another example. First night we had our car, kids came along, wrecked the car, or the wing mirror of the car. One of them threatened the Catholic incomer with the Protestant paramilitaries. My dad's in the UDA, he'll come down and shoot you. Yeah? And what was your reaction to that? Well, we spoke to that guy next door, we spoke to them and said, this happens once in a blue moon, could happen to your car now and not happen for another 10 years. Yeah? Same pattern of anxiety, looking around to the neighbours for support, and for those who had the connections, then the support was offered. So, we do have some numbers to go with this. I'll show you a quick look at that later on, or just in a second. But really what we're suggesting is that increased mobility doesn't automatically reduce positive contact. In fact, relocating, by the fact that you are stripped of all of your social support from your previous community, predisposes you to negative encounters in the destination community. Okay? However, developing a new shared neighbourhood identity offsets that. If you are making bonds with your new community, if you see yourself as part of your new community and you have a communicative infrastructure, you can get that information to reduce the levels of threat, to increase your levels of feeling supported. Okay. And of course there are many limitations to that, but what I would suggest is that a broad implication is that it suggests that we might consider moving away from the question of what damage residential diversification has for communities towards how can we help communities cope with the challenges of contact. How can we increase the social capital and the bonding within communities and between groups within communities to help them cope with contact. And that's a very different question to be asking of this literature. All right. Very briefly, what are the implications for diasporas? Well, you know, in the context that we're looking at, if we're looking at two diasporic groups coming from the same contact and relocating to a host community, you've got two sets of incomers. So potentially you've got two groups who've been stripped of the social support, might be feeling very anxious, relocating to an uncertain environment in which they know that they've got a rival outgroup present. Okay? So it could be a cocktail for disaster. But if you look at it the other way about, then the host society, being aware of this, could be directed towards supporting incomers, yeah, making them feel supported, introducing community infrastructure, communication within communities to offset that feeling of vulnerability and anxiety and facilitate potentially positive contact.